everyone, my name is Kate Lindsey, and I am a professor of linguistics at Boston University. I'm here to talk to you today about linguistic fieldwork and what it is, how to do it, and tell you a little bit about the places in the world that I've done fieldwork in my career. Now, I'm coming to you from my home in Northern California, a little town called Trinidad, right on the coast, just south of Oregon. Now, Trinidad is on the unceded territory of the Wiyot to the south and the Yurok to the north peoples of Northern California. So I want to talk to you today about linguistic fieldwork. Linguistic fieldwork has played a huge role in my career in becoming a linguist. I think it's one of the most important methodologies to learn in linguistics, and it's also one of the most fun. So today I'm just going to be answering some questions about the topic, and my goal for you is for you to come away with a better understanding of what linguistic fieldwork means, how you can do it yourself, and have like an image in your mind of what fieldwork could look like for you. So the first question I'll answer is, what is fieldwork and what is linguistic fieldwork? Well, what fieldwork is it's collecting data, language data, ideally in a community where that language is spoken on a daily basis. Now, you can do linguistic fieldwork on spoken languages or sign languages. When I'm talking today, all of my work has been on spoken languages, so I default to using speakers and talking about how you speak a language instead of how you sign a language. But everything I say today can also be applied to fieldwork that's done on signed languages as well. Now, when you there is this stereotype about linguistic fieldwork that in order to do it, or what real fieldwork is going somewhere very far away, working on a language that is unknown to you or unfamiliar to you, and maybe it's unknown or unfamiliar to a lot of people. Maybe it's an endangered language or a minority language that's spoken by very few people. And perhaps this community speaks this language and is located way off the beaten path. So maybe it takes a while to get there. Maybe you have to hike into your field site. All of these ideas are describe this stereotype of what linguistic fieldwork is. But I want to dispel those ideas. Linguistic fieldwork is simply collecting data about a language from a native speaker. You could also be a native speaker of that language. You can do linguistic fieldwork at your home. You can do linguistic fieldwork in a city, in New York City. Maybe you travel far away. Maybe you hardly leave Boston. You don't have to go very far or work on a language that you don't know in order to do linguistic fieldwork. I have done fieldwork in a variety of places, meaning that I have collected linguistic data to answer questions about linguistics, about the formal structures of language, in many different places in the world. One of the places that I have done fieldwork is in my home town, my home region of the Humboldt Bay in Northern California. Now, in this fieldwork site, the types of questions I was asking were sociolinguistic questions about the variety of English that is spoken in Northern California. Now, I am a native speaker of that variety of American English. And when I collected my data, I collected data from my family, from my friends, from other people who had lived in the area for a long time and were native speakers of that variety of this language. I have also done linguistic fieldwork further away from home. So I spent a couple years living in Western Russia in a region called Chuvashia, looking at the Chuvash language. Now, Chuvash is not, it's not a small language. It's spoken by more than 1 million people. It is not, in some ways, it is quite endangered in that the children of the speakers of these languages, many children are not learning it as a native language anymore. Many children are picking up Russian first. but it's spoken by 1.2 million people, and so you wouldn't say that Chuvash is your typical endangered language. However, I lived here in Chuvashia, and I asked questions about the Chuvash language. Specifically, I was interested in the sound structures of the language. I lived with Chuvash speakers. I lived in a nice apartment. I spent my days in the library. It was a nice big city. It was a comfortable place. The setting itself was not quite as unfamiliar for me. And my contact language with speakers was mostly Russian. And as I learned the Chuvash language, later it became Chuvash as a language that we could communicate in as well. A third place that I've done linguistic fieldwork, which is much different than the first two, is a village called Limol in southern Papua New Guinea. Now in Limol, they speak a language called Ende. Ende is spoken by something between 600 and 800 people. It's a language that I knew nothing about before I started doing my work in Papua New Guinea. In fact, it's a language that no other linguist knew anything about before I started doing my work there. So in this case, it was a very unfamiliar language in a very remote location. It took almost 2 weeks to get from my home in California to the village Limol in Papua New Guinea. 6 different flights flying through Australia and then through the capital of New Guinea into a smaller airport and finally landing on a grass airstrip outside the village, taking a canoe and hiking in. Now in Limol, the setting was very unfamiliar for me. There wasn't electricity or cell phone service. Everything that I had to collect, all of my power, all of my equipment, everything, I had to bring it in myself. So this is a very kind of rugged experience of doing linguistic fieldwork, and may be what some people think is the more stereotypical type of linguistic fieldwork. But like I said, all 3 different types of this linguistic fieldwork, whether it's at home, whether it's in a city, in a country where you speak the language, or whether it's very far away from your home and from languages that you know, these are all valid and legitimate ways of doing linguistic fieldwork. As long as you are in a community, learning a language, observing that language, collecting data, asking linguistic questions about that data, that is linguistic fieldwork. So what does it mean to do fieldwork? I keep saying that you may be in these locations, but what does it mean to do linguistics in a community and with speakers of that language? Well, the first thing that you have to do field work is to come into contact with that language. So that means getting to that community if you are remote. It means creating a contact or connection with speakers of that language or of that variety so that they can invite you in to be doing research with them. These steps are very important steps to take before you can start doing research of any kind with any community, even if it's your own, even if you're going home. You still have to talk to the people that you'll be, whose language you'll be studying, and finding out what it is that you can bring, what kind of questions you're going to be asking, and also what you can learn from them and what they can learn from you in return. Now, once you've established connections with the community, the next thing that you have to do is to start collecting data. Now, for linguistics, our data is language. Whether it's a spoken language or a signed language, our data is going to be any type of recording or any type of representation of that language that we can then analyze. Oftentimes, we use audio recorders, video recorders. We may listen to the language or observe the language and write it down using a kind of formal transcription. And then once we have collected that data, we then can start analyzing it. Sometimes there's already an established way of representing the language in some kind of written form or recorded form that you can then analyze. Oftentimes, a very fun part of fieldwork is coming into contact with the language that doesn't have a formal representation, like a writing system. And the first step then is to establish a writing system so that you can have some kind of written, tangible documents that you can then analyze as part of your linguistic study. Many linguists, of course, if it's a spoken language, start with the IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet, to start writing the language down. And it's through work with community members and speakers of the language that an orthography and spelling system is established. So after you collect the data, you then have to process it, whether that's uploading it onto a computer, transcribing the language, writing it down, connecting your transcriptions and your audio files so that you can find the types of data that you want later. Then you can start analyzing your data. Some linguists analyze data while they're in the field at the same time. Other linguists collect and process their data and then take it back with them to their home academic institution and process it, analyze it later when they have their computers and their access to libraries and the literature. The final step after you analyze the data is that you have to return the data, return what you've learned, or at least a token or a subset of what you've learned back to the community in a way that's meaningful for them, whether that is returning a dictionary, a grammar, a book of songs. There may be something that the community wants as a token of what the type of work that you have all done together. And what that is has to be derived based on conversations with the community and what makes sense for them. Now, the types of data that you collect depends on what type of access you have to the language. If there's only one speaker of the language, then you can't collect conversational data unless you're very clever. But you can, it may be constrained by what kind of access you have to the language, but the types of data you collect are also constrained by the linguistic questions that you have. You may come into a fieldwork type situation with a specific question in mind. Maybe you're a semanticist, maybe you're a syntactician, and you have a very clear question about the formal structure of language that you already know what questions you have. You can also let the language decide what your linguistic questions are. As you learn the language and come into contact with more speakers, start writing down stories and learning songs, you may observe a very interesting facet of the language, and that will prompt you to start asking questions about the structure of the language in those ways. So you can either let the language reveal its complexity and intricacies to you, and ask questions that way, or some linguists come in with a question in mind. That doesn't mean that they don't change their mind once they come into contact with the language, and maybe they discover a new and more interesting question. Something I often get asked about fieldwork is, well, what do you do first? So you come to a community and you start learning the language. Well, you learn about all the different structures of the language when you're learning one all at the same time. You are instantly bombarded with phonetics, all of the different sounds, phonology, how the sounds are structured, morphology, how are words made up of smaller pieces, syntax, how words come together to make sentences, and then semantics, how the meaning of words changes based on the context of that word, and based on what that word is used, what kind of information it's used to convey. You also learn about sociolinguistic variation while speaking and learning a language. You observe how different members of the community speak that language, and how different variables vary with respect to different social factors, different prestige factors, or other types of social variables within the community. So as you're learning the language, you have to be grappling with all of these different levels of linguistic structure all at the same time. But then you pick Maybe you wake up one day and you decide, okay, today is a phonetics day. If you're interested in if you want to know more about the sounds of that language, there are many different types of things that you can do while you're there. You can observe how, for spoken languages, you can observe how people are articulating their language. You can video record them. You can get very close. You can have conversations with people about where their tongue is and how their mouth is moving. You can also use methods such as palatography, where you use a type of charcoal you can paint on their tongue, on any speaker's tongue, and then you use a mirror to see how the charcoal will leave an imprint on any place where the tongue comes into contact. So you can use that to learn more about the articulation of sounds. You can use an ultrasound, which is a device that you hold up to a person's mouth and articulatory system, and it allows you to capture movement within the oral nasal cavity and learn more about articulation that way. You can learn about acoustics by recording audio recordings, digitizing the speech sounds of that language, looking at them on a computer and using programs such as Prof. If you feel like you understand the sounds, you can start looking at how the sounds are structured in the language. To do that, you would look, as we all know, first for minimal pairs to find out what are the phonemes in a language. You would want to look for words like bat and cat that differ just by one sound, and by doing an exploration of that, you can just see how many meaningful sounds are in the language. You can, once you start hearing verbs in different places, you can start, there may be morphologically complex words in the language. Verbs are often morphologically complex, but it could be nouns as well. You'll start seeing patterns, and once you start seeing a pattern, like that a verb looks one way in the past tense and another way in the future tense, you can start investigating how it is that tense works in the language. How is it that morphemes combine? What do morphemes do to the phonology after they combine in a word? And then as you're learning sentences, you may notice that words come in certain orders, and that if you change the order of the words, you change the meaning of the sentence. And there may be certain templates or frames that the language must adhere to, that you must have the subject at the beginning or verbs at the end of the sentences. To do semantic type elicitation, you can develop elicitation tools where you set up a kind of hypothetical context and ask speakers, in a context where I give you an apple, and I say, you can come up with a sentence to be said. And do you want this apple? You can ask speakers, is that a reasonable or appropriate or grammatical thing to say to present somebody with an apple? If you ask somebody, many languages have evidentiality distinctions, and what that means is that when speakers report information, they have to tell you how they heard it. So if you heard that your brother broke his leg, in some languages you have to specify if you saw him break his leg, and that's how you know. If you just heard that he broke his leg, you didn't see it, but that your information came secondhand. If you see him on crutches and just assume that his leg is broken because he's there on crutches, you can set up, basically, you can ask these types of questions to find out if this language has those types of distinctions and what it means. And for sociolinguistic variation, you can interview many different speakers in a community and find out how it is that different speakers speak differently from one another. So what's the most important part of doing fieldwork? For me, I think that it is very important that the fieldwork is a collaborative experience. And what that means is that it's not a researcher doing research on a community of people on their language, but rather it's doing research with a community of people on the language that they speak. Now, this isn't just because it's important to, include others in your research. It's not just important because the perspectives of the speakers of this language are essential to be included in your linguistic analysis. But what it also means is that you get better data. You get having native speakers writing down the language, transcribing the language, understanding the morphological structures, coming up with elicitations to really pinpoint specific meanings in the language. These types of things are sometimes easier done by a native speaker. And so if you yourself are not a native speaker, it's really important to involve native speakers in the process of collecting data, processing it, analyzing it, and returning it to the community. I think that the happiest outcome of a good fieldwork experience is when the community of speakers, when at the end you have speakers that are also linguists that have picked up linguistic skills to do research on their own, and the linguist has become a speaker. They may not be fluent, they may not be a native speaker, but they have learned enough about the language and the culture and the community to be an active member in that speech community. One of the best examples I have of this is my experience in Papua New Guinea. And so I wanted to tell you a little bit about how I got involved with that community. I have a couple pictures. So here is my main contact in the village of Limol in southern New Guinea. This is Warama Krupal here in the center, and his sons, Matthew and Tony, on the left and right. Now in 2015, these three men traveled to a nearby village where a linguist was working and asked if this linguist could pass on their information to another linguist who might want to come and do linguistic research with them. So that information got passed on to me, and I called up Warama, talked to him about what it would mean for me to come to their village. I wanted to know what they wanted to get out of this working relationship. I told them about my linguistic interests and what I wanted to get out of this relationship, and that was a finished dissertation. We agreed, and I got on a plane and went to Papua New Guinea. For those of you who don't know where Papua New Guinea is, it's an island that is shared with Indonesia on the west. Papua New Guinea is on the right, and it's just north of Australia. And while I was there, I got to meet more than 200 members of that village, people who lived in the village. The first thing that we did is we had a village meeting where I introduced myself and we discussed how we would collaborate in order for me to ask my questions about the language, and for the community to understand more about their language as well, and to get some specific outcomes like a spelling system for their language, a writing system. They wanted some books in Ende written for the elementary school, and also increased literacy within the community of writing and reading in Ende. Now this was a very happy, successful, collaborative relationship between me and the Ende tribe. I think a big reason for that was because it was initiated not by me, but by members Warama, Matthew, and Tony. And so throughout our entire relationship of working together, we were always discussing and making sure that both the community and me as the researcher were learning and thriving, and getting what we wanted out of that relationship. So what were my favorite parts of doing fieldwork? Well, I was in Limol in Papua New Guinea for almost a year. I wouldn't have kept going back if I didn't love it. The language, I learned so much about the language at all these different levels of structure, but there were a couple things that really stood out for me. One of my favorite things about doing fieldwork is about learning a way to communicate in a language that I didn't know was possible before. One example of this in Ende is that in Ende there are 4 different ways of counting. The first way of counting, way of using numerals, is the Ende words for 1, 2, and 3. Many times, 1, 2, and 3 are enough to talk about, well, I guess any amount less than 3, but these are the 3 most commonly used numbers in the language. If you're going to talk about quantities of things that are larger than 3, there are a couple different ways to do it. Ende has a body part counting system where you can count to 19 by referring to different parts of your body. In this case, the pinky would be 1, the thumb would be 5, the chest is 10, and you can use these the names for these body parts to count all the way up to 19. I have a video of somebody doing this here, so I'll play it for you now.
Okay, go.
Trisa, Katolma, Mutkin, Tupi, Manda, Gaben, Tankum, Mata, Nono, Dar, Ate Nuno, Ate Mata, Ate Tankum, Ate Gaben, Ate Manda, Ate Tupi, Ate Mutkin, Ate Katolma, Trisa.
The third way of counting in Ende is only used if you're counting yams. So Ende has borrowed this centenary-based counting system, which is a base 6 counting system, from the Western languages, the languages that are spoken to the west of them, which are called Yam languages. And in this system, you can count as high as you want, but the base is 6. So you have 1, 2, 2 plus 1, 2 plus 2, 2 plus 2 plus 1, 6. 6 plus 1, 6 plus 2, 6 plus 2 plus 1, 6 plus 2 plus 2, 6 plus 2 plus 2 plus 1, 12. 12 plus 1, 12 plus 2, and so on. They have special words for the powers of 6. So just how we have 10, 100, 1,000, a million, in Ende you have special numbers, or in this system, you have special numbers for 6, 36, 216, 1,296, and so all of those base 6s are have special numbers just like we have for the powers of 10. But typically these are only used for counting yams, and so in this picture here you can see that when the yams are harvested from the gardens, they're brought back to the village and they're set in piles of 6, and each of those piles of 6 is counted in order to find out how many yams you have for the year. The other aspect of Ende language that really fascinated me while I was there was the verbal morphology. Every day I tried to elicit a new paradigm of a different verb to understand how the verbs worked and how the morphemes came together to provide meaning for the verb. So if we think about, let's look at a paradigm in English, like the paradigm of to walk. So we have 2 tenses. We have the present tense and the past tense. And we have 6 different types of subjects. We have first person, second person, and third person, and we have singular and plural subjects for this intransitive verb. And what that sounds like is I walk, you walk, she walks, we walk, you all walk, they walk. That's the present tense. Then the past tense, you get I walked, you walked, they walked, she, he, or they walked, we walked, you all walked, and they walked. Now you can see that there's this S that marks the present third person singular subject. That's the semantic contribution of that S is that this is present tense, it's a third person singular subject. Then you have this morpheme ED, which is the past tense. It doesn't mark subject, it doesn't mark number, but just past tense. And then you have the root, walk. So each of these verbs is made up of 2 pieces. One of them is a root, and one of them adds some grammatical meaning. You then have, let's look at a paradigm in Ende. We'll look at an intransitive paradigm because the intransitive paradigms are simpler than the transitive ones. And we're going to look at a regular verb. Irregular verbs in the language are much more complicated. So you can see here that there's already many more forms of the verb than there were in English. If we start looking at the morphemes, the smaller pieces, we see that there's an initial D that has the meaning of remote past. So that means anything that happened before yesterday evening. You then have initial N, which means recent past, so anything that's happened since yesterday evening. You also have a prefix that stands for future, which vacillates between a B for the future tense and also something that looks like the recent past tense, and is only used for second person forms. So you have this prefix whenever you have something in the future tense. We then have a suffix un, which is used in the remote past tense and the future tenses for third non-dual subjects, so that's singular and plural. Ende has a distinction between singular, dual, and plural, whereas English only has a distinction between singular and plural. You have a suffix that stands for remote first and second person dual and future first person dual. A suffix that stands for remote third person dual and future second and third person dual. A suffix that stands for recent past, first and third person non-dual. Another that stands for recent past, second person non-dual. Recent past, first and second person dual. Recent past, third person dual subject. Those are all of the affixes. You then see changes to the root as well. So in English, we had walk all the way across as the root, but in Ende you have two different forms of the root. One is indug or dindu, and that is the non-plural form of the root. And then you have this other form of the root, which is ismol or wismol, which stands for the plural of run. So if you have a plural subject, you're going to get this plural root. If we compare the intransitive verbal morphology in Ende and English, you can see that that quite clearly that the Ende verbal morphology is much more complicated and has many different categories and many more distinctions than the English one does at all. So all of this I found very fascinating trying to figure it out. I collected more than 500 verbs to fully understand the full morphological paradigm. So if that kind of data collection and analysis is really interesting to you, then there are 6,000 languages in the world, and I would say that I would hope that many of them have much more complicated morphology than languages like English do. So finally, I just want to answer this last question about what advice do I have for you if you're interested in doing linguistic fieldwork. So the first thing that I would say is to look around you. Think about the people that you know. Think about the connections you have, the professors you've met. Are there speakers of a variety or of a language that is of interest to you? It could be your hometown, the languages that your parents and your siblings speak. It could be a language that you came into contact in a class, or maybe you've met somebody who speaks a language that you don't know much about and you want to know more about. You may have connections with a professor who does linguistic fieldwork or another linguist that you can learn more about the type of work that they do and see how you can get involved. I think it's really important when you're thinking about doing linguistic fieldwork is to think about what types of skills and things that you have to offer a speaker of a language. Can you help them understand their language in a new and interesting way that they may not already understand about their language? Do you have specific skills such as transcribing songs or writing a dictionary or telling stories or other things that you may be able to provide to a community of speakers who are interested in their language in return for them teaching you about their language, about their culture, about their community. To gain more skills, it's important to take more linguistics classes and be able to understand all the different levels of linguistic structure that we see in language. And of course, it's super important to take a field methods class. In a field methods class, you learn about how to collect data, how to process it, how to analyze it, and how to return it to the community. I'm teaching field methods at Boston University, typically every spring. So if you're interested in that, make sure you get a hold of me. We look at a new language every semester, and we spend 14 weeks figuring out, learning the skills that you need to know in order to collect, process, and analyze the data, linguistic data. And also, we learn more about the language that has been chosen for that class for that semester. So here's my name and my email address. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, and I would love to answer anything that you want to know about fieldwork, about what it's like to do research in the United States, in Russia, in Papua New Guinea, or anything else. So thanks very much. Bye.